Come for the bread, stay for the politics. I'm Ben Walsh, and this is Let Them Eat Bread. Today we are making my same traditional challah recipe as last week, but as promised, there will be a twist. See if you can figure it out before we get there. So, because we're making that regular challah recipe, we are going to need to bloom some yeast. So let's start there. So here I have some water, about 110 degrees. Just make sure that's the right temperature there. Stir a little bit. And in this container, I have approximately 1 tablespoon of active dry yeast and 1 tablespoon of granulated sugar. Remember that the reason that we put the sugar in this mixture is so that the yeast has something to eat. And so it shows it's blooming much better. As usual, we're going to take our fork and just give it a light fluffing here. Again, you want your water to be between 105 and 110 degrees Fahrenheit. If you don't have a thermometer to do that, remember you can always use the pinky test. And as a reminder, the pinky test is essentially where you put your pinky in the water, and if it feels like it's warm enough to bathe in, then that's the correct temperature. So, I'm going to set a timer for 10 minutes to get that going, and we'll put some other ingredients together. All right, so we should have our 10-minute timer going. In this bowl is an additional 6 ounces of water here, and this is where most of our wet ingredients are going to go. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our eggs. So we have 2 whole eggs and 1 egg yolk. Just put it in here. Now, your water is going to be warm, but it will not be warm enough to cook the eggs, so you don't have to worry about that. And if you are a little concerned that your water might be too hot, one of the things you can do is just give it a quick whisking, and that will allow some air to come in and cool it down. All right, next we have our 7 tablespoons of oil. This is just regular vegetable oil. I'm going to put in here. And then finally, our sweetener, we're going to take 7 tablespoons of honey. And this is probably going to need some help to come out. So if you have a spatula or a knife, it'll be helpful to just put all this in. And then, once you've gotten all that your honey out, might take you a moment. Honey is quite sticky after all. Just to get it in the bowl there. We're going to whisk it together slowly at first, and then we're going to speed up to make sure that all these ingredients are well combined before we mix them with our dry ingredients. Come on, honey. What do you... Come on. Come out of the bowl. You'll find that as you continue to bake, you will end up talking more and more to your ingredients if they're not cooperative. See, there's still some honey in there, but the hope is that I got most of it out. All right, let's get rid of that. We might need this later. Oh, and I forgot to get a whisk out, so get a whisk or a fork, and we'll start mixing this together. All right. So let's get this going, nice and slow at first. Remember, the honey is going to make this difficult to whisk, so if you try whisking very quickly, what's going to end up happening is you're going to get your wet ingredients everywhere, which is not what we want. We want it just to be all in the bowl, nice and evenly combined. And of course, as it gets easier to mix this, you can speed up your whisking. But the most important part of this is to make sure all the ingredients are combined. So make sure your whisk or your fork is getting to the bottom of the bowl and just dislodging that honey from the bottom of the bowl so that you get all that sweetness in there and all the liquids combined nicely. So you see here now that I have a nice kind of yellowy mixture. We are done with that for now. right, so you can put your whisk away. You will no longer need it. All right, so let's put our liquids back here. Our yeast is still blooming, so we have to contend with how our solid mixtures, our solid ingredients, our dry ingredients. So here I have 6 cups of bread flour. And to this, we're going to add 1 tablespoon of salt. You can add a little more, a little less. It entirely is up to you. I recommend a tablespoon because I think it's a good amount, but if you don't like salt that much, you can use a teaspoon. If you want a loaf that's a little saltier, you can add 2 tablespoons. It's really up to you. It will not affect the chemistry too much. So we're going to use this spatula here to mix our salt in with our flour, just lightly so we don't get the flour everywhere. This week I am making the challah recipe in a bowl. Last week I used a standing mixer, and I explained how to do it in a bowl, but this week I'm just doing it in a bowl. Again, this process up to now is pretty much the same if you're using a standing mixer, if you're baking it, if you're combining your dough on a board, or if you're doing it in a bowl. So I'll start to tell you where it deviates, but for now, it's all the same. Okay, so my salt and my flour is combined such that you can't see any of the salt. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take our spatula and we're going to create a little well in our bowl. So you can see I'm just pushing to the side. Well, it's not going to work that much on that side, and I'll right the bowl to get that right. But you can essentially see what I'm doing. I'm pushing the flour up to the edge of the bowl to create a nice little well for our wet ingredients to be poured into, which will help them mix together better. What you're doing with this process, by the way, is you're creating a larger surface area for the wet ingredients and the dry ingredients to mix. So it becomes easier to mix them together. So don't discount this step, it's very important. If you're doing this on a board and all your ingredients are kind of stacked in a board, what you're going to do is you're going to create a large ovular well on your board of flour and your salt mixture. And make sure the walls are pretty tall. You probably want your walls to be about 3 inches tall or about the height of your index finger. This is because when you pour in the liquid mixture, it's going to slosh around a little bit as you start to move it. So you want to make sure that your liquid mixture isn't able to breach the dam, as it were. You also want your walls to be fairly thick. This will also prevent leakage. And leakage can be disastrous, especially early on in the process of making your bread on a board. If you're doing this in a standing mixer, you don't have to use a spatula to create this well. You can just use your dough hook, put it in the salt and flour mixture, and it will naturally create a well if you leave it on for about 30 seconds to a minute. Okay, so let's check on our yeast mixture. It's coming along, but it still needs a little bit more time. That's all right, not a big deal. One of the things that's important to remember is you have to be patient with your yeast. If your yeast isn't reacting for some reason or it's reacting slowly, give it a little bit more time. There's a good chance it's just having a slow reaction or it's waking up more slowly, right? But the purpose of blooming yeast is to make sure that it's alive. So give it some time. If after about 10 or 15 minutes, it is not blooming at all, there's no foam on top whatsoever, your yeast is probably dead and you need to both start over and you need to get more yeast. All right, so there's a little bit of time left on our mixture here. In the meanwhile, while I have you all here, Sunday is Mother's Day. So Mom, if you're watching, happy Mother's Day. And remind Dad to, treat you nice. No, I'm just kidding. You guys are great. But Mom, happy Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there, dog moms, cat moms, adopted moms, non-adopted moms, all the moms. Happy Mother's Day. I hope you take Sunday to enjoy yourself in any way you see fit. And just have an enjoyable time. Hopefully lots of people shower you with love and praise, and gifts aren't so bad either, I'm sure. And so I hope you guys have a great Mother's Day. All right, so our yeast is blooming quite a little bit here. You can see that you can see if I move this closer to the camera, that there are two layers. There's a foamy layer and a liquid layer underneath. So I think this is ready. So I'm going to turn off our timer. Oh, one last point about the yeast that I probably should have mentioned earlier. The reason we cover it is to keep all the heat in and to make sure that it stays nice and warm as it's coming back to us, because the yeast is dehydrated and essentially dead, and you're using this process to more or less bring it back to life. Okay, so we are going to take our yeast mixture and we're going to pour it into our well, like so. This is the same process if you're using a standing mixer. Hold on if you're baking yours on, if you're shaping yours on a board. Okay, give me 1 second. I'll give you some instructions. All right, we're going to pour the rest of our liquid in. If you're working on a board, still hold on. You can see that some of my honey did not get mixed in the way I wanted it to. Okay, that's fine. No big deal. Okay, if you are making this on a board and you have a nice big oval and you've got high and thick dam walls, you want to pour directly into the center very slowly. You want your liquid to be able to spread out at an even pace so it doesn't damage the structural integrity of your walls, okay? And what you want to do after that is you want to take your index finger and your middle finger, put them down on the edge in the liquid near one of your walls, and slowly do a round motion forwards and backwards as you see fit all the way around your wall. What this does is it slowly combines the large amount of liquid with the solids of your walls without totally collapsing them, okay? You're going to do this for 2 or 3 times until your liquid gets a little thicker. It'll get to a little thicker than like a mucus or a paste. All right, that's where you want it. And once you do that, you can use your hands or a bench scraper to start to take some of that wall, especially where it's shallower, and start flicking it up into the mixture. Of course, the end goal is just to make sure that everything is combined and you have a nice ball of dough. For me, working in a bowl, or using a stand mixer. So if you're using a stand mixer, you just put this on the stir setting until your standing mixer sounds like it's struggling, and then you turn it up to the next setting. Oops, lost a bit of dough there. And if you're in a bowl, you just want to keep slowly mixing around. You can see a dough is already starting to form here. And you just keep mixing the dry ingredients and the wet ingredients around until you have a rough dough. Once you do that, unless you are using your standing mixer to do the kneading, which you can do, I demonstrated how to do that last week. Unless you are doing that, you are going to turn your rough ball of dough onto a lightly floured board. And when I say lightly floured, I mean pretty lightly floured. You can always add more as you need, but you want to make sure that you're not drying out your dough before you have a chance to get it, before it has a chance to kind of develop more gluten. So just something to keep in mind. So you want to mix this until a rough ball comes together. And so this is not a rough ball. You can see that there are lots of parts of it that aren't really attached. You want it to be kind of one large unit. Sorry, I keep moving it away from the camera. You want to make sure it's more or less one large unit, and then it comes out of the bowl together. So I'm going to keep doing this because I have some, I don't know if you can see it, but I have some more flour at the bottom of my bowl. So I'm going to keep mixing this around. But if doing this with a spatula is not working, just get in there with your hands. Fold the dough, make sure that it's getting the flour on it, make sure that the liquid and the dry ingredients, the wet and the dry ingredients are combining. I think I'm about to give up on this for now. So let's get my hands in there. So just turn it over, do a little bit of a kneading motion, not too much, because the real kneading is going to happen on the board. But but just enough to get all that extra flour mixed in. Remember, we're still in the mixing phase. We're not really in the kneading phase. So just be careful. And if you're struggling and if this isn't working for you and you just want to deposit it on your board and clean up that way, you're welcome to do that too. Because sometimes, you know, the bowl's just too small. Your ingredients aren't, you know, they're coming together, but you can't really get the dough to do what you want it to do. Just put it onto a board. And it will get easier, I promise. All right, so I'm almost there with mine. You can see that although there's a little bit of flour left in my bowl, that I have a solid mass coming together. So I think I can probably get almost all of this in here. And by the way, this part of the process is very unscientific. It will be different for you every week. Even if you make the exact same recipe, even if you weigh out your ingredients instead of doing them by volume like I do, however you do it, it's going to be different every time. It will never be exactly the same. It'll be similar, but it'll never be exactly the same. And part of this, by the way, is because there's moisture in the air. Your house is a different temperature each time you bake. So there are lots of things that contribute to the dough acting different. All right, so you can see now there's pretty much nothing left in this bowl, and I have one solid mass of dough. So we're going to take that there. I'm going to clean up just a little bit here, just get some of this dough off my hands. We're going to use it, don't throw it away. And don't worry about dough sticking on your hands or reusing dough that's on your hands. This is going to bake, so anything that you'd be worried about will get killed in the oven. But also, I highly encourage you to wash your hands as often as possible during this process. I wash my hands before starting the show. Also, after handling eggshells, it's important to wash your hands. And when you're touching things that could be dirty. All right, so let's flour the old board a little bit. Just a tiny, 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 tiny bit. So you can see how lightly that I've done this. Let's put that there. We're going to use our spatula, just get that last bit of dough out from our bowl. It's going to be a little dry at first, but that's okay. We're going to stretch and pull and tug. Okay. We are ready to begin. So remember, kneading, we're going to take our hand, we're going to push forward with our palm and bring back, and then we're going to rotate 90 degrees and do it all over again. You want to get as much stretch on this as possible. If the dough tears, that's just fine. You can also just do one-handed. I'm doing a two-handed knead, just like that. There are lots of ways to knead, as I have said in the past. What I'm doing now is your standard one-handed knead. So I'm just using my palm to stretch the dough and then fold it back on itself. I was doing a two-handed knead earlier. There's a fun method of kneading that I want to try on the show, but it's very loud. So I will need a microphone before that. So if you want to pitch in to help buy the microphone, that would be greatly appreciated. Message me on Facebook. Message the page on Facebook. And if I get a microphone and I can get it far enough away, I'll do the slap method of kneading. One, it's a ton of fun. Two, it's just fun looking. And it does do the job. It's not just for theatrics. It actually kneads the bread. But it's very loud. And if I do it here, I'm going to mess up my audio. So we're gonna stay away from the slap method for now. Sorry, until I can get a microphone, or until the microphone is a little microphone for my apron here is gifted to the show. So you're going to keep doing this until the bread is tacky and not sticky and passes the window pane test. Or if you're not working on a stone board that removes some of the heat each time, until your bread's about 80 degrees in the center. You can use the thermometer for that. But I highly recommend the window pane test, since the window pane test measures how much gluten is developed. And the temperature test is more about how it's going to rise, notwithstanding how much gluten has been developed. So I like to use the window pane test, one, because it's fun to demonstrate, and two, because I personally think it's just more accurate. All right. And remember, the purpose of kneading, however you want to knead, is to just stretch that dough, develop the gluten, just going to help it rise. So just make sure that whatever motion you're using, or whatever hand you're doing, you're stretching this dough and folding it back on itself. And the reason that we rotate it 90 degrees or fold it over itself is that we're kneading different parts of the dough each time. If you only knead one part of the dough, then it stands to reason that the dough is not going to rise evenly. And that will not be very nice. All right, so let's check in with our dough. So it's definitely tacky. I can put my hand on it, can leave it on for a couple seconds, take it off and no dough comes off. Other side, not so much. So we're not quite done yet. It does stick a little bit to my hand when I've got it like that. So we're gonna need a little bit longer. If you need more flour at any point in this process, it becomes too difficult to knead without it, or your hands are sticking, just add some more flour. Again, baby bits at a time. If you dry out your dough, it will be very difficult to save it at this point. Bread dough is typically forgiving, but it is forgiving more or less up until this part of it. You know, once you've got it in this form, if you make a mistake, like drying it out, it can be very difficult to correct. So obviously just make sure you're careful. All right, so I think this is probably good. There's only one way to find out. So let's plop our dough down. I'm gonna use my hands like this, press down, form a ball with my thumb and forefinger, twist that ball off, and then we're gonna use our hands to carefully stretch this out into like a pizza, like you do with a pizza dough. And keep stretching it out with your thumbs until it's very thin. And then you can start doing the window pane test. You can just see. Okay, so remember the window pane test is we're going to hold this very thin piece of dough up to some light and see if we can see light coming through it. And we can. Take a look. You should be able to see, well, you shouldn't see me, but you should see the light coming through it, right? Okay. So we know that this is ready. So let's give it a couple more kneads. Let's just give it a little bit more kneading. And then what I like to do in order to make sure that once my preparations are done for rising, it comes off, let's just put a tiny bit of flour on it for it to sit on. So we're gonna form it into a taut ball. So the way that we do that, remember, is we take our hands in a cup motion, we put them on each side of the bread, and then we just roll the bread between our hands until the top of the dough becomes nice and taut and even. And the reason this works, by the way, because the dough is tacky. If the dough is completely dry, this doesn't work. So you'll start to see the top thin out, become smoother. To the point you can literally run your hand over it. All right, so when you're satisfied, or until you can push down on it and it bounces right back up, let's just spread this out a little bit. We're gonna put our ball of dough right on that little bit of flour, and then we're gonna get ready for rising. So what's gonna happen now is I use a glass bowl for rising. And because glass has a tendency to be a little cooler than room temperature, and also because it's a little cooler in my house today, I'm going to run over this with hot water just until it feels like it's a little warm. And then we're going to deposit in, then we are going to put some oil in our bowl to make sure the bread doesn't stick as it rises. And after that, we're going to put in the dough, cover it, set a timer for an hour, and talk some politics. So I'll be right back. I'm going to warm my bowl. If your bowl is pre-warmed, start putting a little bit of oil in it, and I'll see you back in just a moment. All right, so now that my bowl is thoroughly warm, just gonna dry it off. Make sure there's no water inside the bowl if you can. Okay, so our bowl is nice and warm. So now we're going to take a little bit of oil. So you don't want to use more than a tablespoon. A teaspoon is actually probably fine. All right. And we're just going to move this around the bowl for a little bit just to get it moving. And then once you're ready, take your hands or a spatula if you don't want to use your hands, and just make sure there's a nice, thin, even layer of oil all throughout your bowl. A little bit of oil will be left over. It'll sit on the bottom. That's okay. If you feel like there's too much oil on the bottom, then feel free to just remove some of it. All right, so we're going to take our bread, put it here. We're going to take some of that excess oil and just roll our ball of dough in it to make sure that all of it is covered with oil. This is going to help with the rising process. Okay, good thing I kept that napkin for the oil. Okay, so I'm going to take some plastic wrap to keep the heat in, and I'm going to put a towel over it. To additionally keep the heat in, we're using a double protective method here, if you will. Okay. Make sure this is nice and tight. As much as possible, we want to keep everything in here. All right, and keep the environment nice and warm. All right, so we're going to put our towel over it. This will additionally help to insulate the bread so that heat does not escape. I'm going to set a timer for 1 hour. All right, so we have set our timer for 1 hour, and after we talk a little bit of politics, we will be right back. All right, so what is on the whiteboard this week? All right, so there's two big topics that have been in the news recently. One is obviously coronavirus and the vaccines for coronavirus, which have been pretty much dominating the news recently. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And then, of course, there is tax. Taxes have been dominating the news as well. Joe Biden just recently put out his infrastructure plan. I forget the exact price tag of it, but it's in theory it's going to be a very expensive infrastructure plan, which is good. We need to spend money. We need to get money in the economy. It'll create good jobs, yada yada. But the thing is, we have to talk. There's all this talk about how we're going to pay for it. And although I've talked in previous episodes about modern monetary theory, I do want to talk a little bit about taxes in general, whether it's taxes that people like you and I pay, people like the very rich pay, and how to better tax those individuals so that the tax burden is put less on regular individuals and more on people at the very top. So those are kind of the two major topics I want to talk about today. So I'm going to start with coronavirus and vaccine stuff, and we'll move to taxes a little later if I have time. So if you have not yet heard, there's this UN program called COVAX. COVAX is a worldwide regime. It's run by the WHO and the United Nations, and essentially says, hey, rich countries, you are making these vaccines at a very steady clip. You're also using them at a very steady clip. If you have extra, when you have extra, send them to this organization called COVAX, and we at the UN and the World Health Organization will look around the world at poorer countries, less developed countries, however you want to refer to them, and we will distribute them based on need. So as you may know from watching last week's episode, of course, the major need in a quote-unquote underdeveloped, quote-unquote poor country is India, right? The case count has exploded there. There's about 300,000 cases per day, about 3,000 deaths per day. It's incredibly tragic. The images coming out of there and the video coming out of there is very tragic as well. So in theory, COVAX could really help India out, right? So there's a couple problems. One, there's not been broad participation by rich nations into COVAX. So the program has been highly ineffective so far. The US has pledged some level of vaccinations to them, but we've been using vaccinations kind of as a soft power tool instead of actually just donating them to, instead of just donating them to COVAX, right? So we gave some to Mexico. We're giving some to India on our own accord. We're not putting it in the hand of the United Nations to distribute by need. So in theory, COVAX would be a good program, but the problem is it doesn't account for the hoarding tendencies of the richer nations. And by the way, the hoarding tendency of the richer nations is largely influenced by the fact that these pharmaceutical companies exist within these richer nations, and they are fiercely trying to protect their intellectual property laws. So I'm sure you're familiar with this point with the patents that are on the COVID vaccines, whether they were produced in the UK or the US or whatever. All the vaccine names that you can think of, all those are protected by intellectual property rights, and specifically through patents. So there has been this movement in the World Trade Organization, which is a large body, which many nations are a part, to waive these rights, waive the patent rights. And although in theory this is a great idea, it still has problems. So one of the reasons I call this particular segment, and we're on the green sticky, by the way, Change Not Charity, is because COVAX and the World Trade Organization's patent waiver, these are all charitable exercises, right? And the truth is that the charity only lasts for as long as the grantor, the person who's giving the charity, is interested in doing it, right? So we are allowing potentially millions of people to die because we, in the United States and Germany and the UK and whatever, are essentially deciding what level of charity we're comfortable giving to the remainder of the world. So the system is obviously unsustainable, and this is especially true when you consider the possibility that we may actually need regular COVID shots, right? We may need one every 6 months or one like every year, like we do with the flu, right? There's been some talk at high levels in the scientific community about the possibility of you needing a regular COVID shot in order to keep the pandemic at bay and to make sure that we don't have any large-scale outbreaks. Like we do with the flu, it would become a very normal thing. But if this is required, you can see that the limits of charity are going to be essentially, to what point can profits continue to be made, right? Oftentimes, and especially in the United States, the pharmaceutical lobby has an incredible amount of power over politicians, and they are lobbying those politicians to essentially make sure that whatever negotiation, whatever deal is done, that those pharmaceutical companies continue to get their profits. So the charity aspect of this is not nefarious. I do think the people who are doing this think that they're doing the right thing, but it's inherently unsustainable and it's inherently unfair. The COVAX portion of it could have been more fair, but imagine instead of a charity program to COVAX, that COVAX was a more mandatory program. Well, so the question becomes then, how do you do that? One would be for governments to nationalize their pharmaceutical companies and to remove the whole patent issue in general. Because if we did that and there was a more global understanding of health and infectious disease, and these pharmaceutical companies were nationalized, by the way, just a quick aside here, most of the research and development for these vaccines, for these drugs in most cases, is done at public and private universities with government money, whether it's the United States government or the UK government or any other government that spends a lot of their money doing research and development, giving grants to researchers who are doing this kind of work and things like that. Almost never is it the case that these companies are actually putting in the dollars and cents themselves. The cost for them typically is buying the rights to something once it's already been created and vetted, or investing in something that they think they can make a large profit off of later. Again, a system that is inherently unsustainable, but that's a conversation for a different day. So if we had a system that was more focused on global health as opposed to national health or profit-based health, we would be able to take essentially all the vaccines being made. And by the way, this would increase the number of vaccines being made, because essentially any country that had the manufacturing capability to create vaccines would be able to do so, right? You wouldn't be worried about specifically rich nations just making vaccines and giving them away, right? You could instead have a central body, a central world body saying, you know, this place should make these vaccines, this place should make these vaccines. Once the vaccines are made, here's where they should go. And plans can be done, right? Once there's some predictability about this, planning can be done, and we could really make sure that we have to vaccinate the globe. And by the way, vaccinating the globe is not just some moral idea, some high-minded ideal. It's incredibly practical. Viruses, like the coronavirus, will mutate as it seeks to survive, as it adapts to live, right? Viruses evolve much faster than humans do. And essentially what happens is, the longer we take to vaccinate the entire globe against a particular virus, the more likely it becomes that some individual somewhere catches coronavirus that then mutates, infects someone else, and becomes the dominant strain. And then what happens if this strain cannot be fought against with vaccines? We essentially end up back where we started with the pandemic, and then we're having these conversations all over again, where the vaccines no longer work, or the vaccines have limited working, or you have to get a vaccine fairly frequently. You can see where there are lots of problems here with this. So we need to move away from this idea that the whole world is going to be dependent on the charity of a few countries. Because charity is not sustainable. It will always be the case that at some point the giver will decide that they no longer want to give, or some other priority will come up for them. So, for example, in this particular scenario, say that a better vaccine comes out, or there's a different strain of the coronavirus that comes out, and the US-made vaccine still works for it. If the US is was sending these vaccines away to another country, then they may no longer have the interest to do that, right? They may feel the need to stop giving in order to vaccinate their own population, right? Because the politicians who are making these charitable decisions are also responsive, in theory, to the people to their electorate, right? But if the system was not based on charity, if it was instead based on central planning and global health and world ownership in some ways, or multinational ownership of the production of these drugs, then it wouldn't really matter what one politicians believed was right for them or not. Essentially, the situation would be such that the vaccines would go where they're needed and not where some countries decide it is beneficial for them to go. Luckily, to go back to my earlier point about us giving vaccines to India, luckily India is an ally of ours. But can you imagine the situation if, say, Iran had this huge deadly outbreak and couldn't control it and couldn't get vaccines? Well, there's a huge part of the world that thinks Iran is the most evil place that has ever been, right? So, but millions of people live in Iran, and many of them have nothing to do with the politics or the government of Iran, much like India, right? But we've decided that Iran is the bad guy. We've decided that Iran is not our ally. So what if an outbreak like this happens in Iran? Do we just allow everyone in that country to die because we say that, well, we're not going to give charity to a country that we don't like? Or even worse, we say, well, actually, now we're going to use this as leverage against you to make you do things that we want, to exercise soft power on you. This is why charity, especially in the case of these vaccines, is unsustainable and unfair. We have the ability to vaccinate the world. We just need to share the technologies with these other countries to create the vaccines, or just share the formulas, right? Some countries have the technology to build a vaccine, they just don't have the formula, right? They don't have the ingredients list, the instructions, what have you. So if we share that, we can get more vaccines created, we can get them where they need to go, and we can vaccinate the world, and we can finally end the coronavirus pandemic. Really, that should be the end goal, not soft power, not particular benefits for certain citizens and things like that. And I'm going to get to, after this, I'm going to get to a story where I talk a little bit about the privilege of some nations over others and the privilege of some people over others with regard to the coronavirus. But the truth is, if we're really serious as a country, as a world, at ending the coronavirus pandemic, we would fundamentally change the way that we view pharmaceuticals. We would make them either a nationalized industry, or we would seize their means of production on a national level temporarily or permanently, so that we can refocus our efforts to a global basis, right? Because the way that we're going now, we are not going to vaccinate the world before we run out of time to do so. Every day, untold numbers of people are infected with the coronavirus. It only takes one person, okay? It only takes one person to have a mutation occur inside of them, and then for that strain to become the dominant strain, for them to share it with one other person, right? All that has to happen is that the virus has to mutate inside of them before it kills them, and then they have to pass it to some other person. And literally every day, every hour, every minute, every second that we spend arguing over the semantics of who can make profit, sorry, not semantics, but arguing over who can make profit off this vaccine is a second wasted in this race that is so serious that It could undo all the work we've done, all the pain that we've suffered. Imagine everyone who's died in the pandemic so far. Think about the numbers. It's potentially millions of people. If we don't vaccinate the whole world, every one of those deaths is in vain. And I hate to say that because it's such a strong statement, but it's true. If we don't vaccinate the globe, then what will have been the point of all those deaths? We're just going to have repeats. We're going to have more and more death everywhere. We're going to have lockdowns. We're going to have all the nonsense that we saw for a year that people liked or didn't like or whatever. We have an opportunity in this country and in every rich country to really fundamentally change the way that we think about health. And we have the opportunity and the resources to vaccinate the globe. We just have to do it. And we need to forget or disincentivize or get rid of the healthcare for profit model, whether it's pharmaceuticals or otherwise. Because if we don't do that, we will never get to full vaccination. And we definitely won't get there in time. So it is my hope that we have, we have the ability that we have the political will to do this. Because if not, I don't even want to think about what's going to happen. So in that same vein, it does look like, the news broke this week that the Biden administration is going to, quote, engage in the talks for the waiver of the patent rights. So what does this mean? So see, there's kind of a weird politician speak going on here where, the Biden administration put out the statement like, oh yeah, we're going to go to the WTO and we're going to negotiate this and we're going to push for the waiver of the patent rights. So I hope I explained in my last segment why there are some issues with that and why this kind of charitable exercise is short-term at best. But in theory, this is a good thing, right? In theory, like, yes, pressure on the Biden administration worked. Left activists and regular folks called their Congress people. They pushed the Biden administration. Now the Biden administration has come out and they said they're going to advocate for the patent waiver. So there's just a little problem with that. See, at the World Trade Organization, in order for anything to get done, according to their bylaws, there has to be consensus, which means that all nations in the WTO, and I don't remember how many there are a bunch though, have to agree that something is going to happen in order for it to happen. So essentially, because unanimity is required, you only need one country to say, no, we refuse, and then the whole effort is dead again. Well, very shortly after the United States said that they are going to push for the patent waiver, there was a country that decided that they were not going to push the patent waiver, and that country was Germany. So Angela Merkel of Germany has come out and said that Germany is against the waiver of the patent rights. So this move from the Biden administration, it wasn't a win at all. I mean, we worked so hard for nothing. And not to be conspiratorial or to assume, nefarious intent, but, it's entirely possible the Biden administration talked to the Merkel administration and said, hey, I'm getting lots of pressure at home to advocate for this. Why don't we just swap positions? I don't believe Angela Merkel, in fairness to Merkel, I don't think she had put her cards out just yet. I think just the US was the one who said they weren't going to fight for it. So, but it's entirely possible that they went to the Germans and they said, hey, we're going to say we're for it, but you say you're against it and then it'll be good. Well, we'll never get it done anyway. It'll be fine. And the pharma companies, by the way, some of these pharma companies are based in Germany. I think, which is the one? Bayer. Bayer is based in Germany, if I remember correctly. And they're a big pharmaceutical company that owns lots of other pharmaceutical companies. So, it's great that the Biden administration, said that they're going to do this and that they're going to fight for it, but now they have to convince Germany that that Germany should get on board with this. And so we actually have to keep the pressure on the Biden administration, because it's not enough for the Biden administration to say, oh, we're going to go there and fight for it. We now know who our enemy is. Germany is the enemy in this particular fight. We have to find a way to use U.S. power, whatever it is, or deals or negotiation to convince the German government to go forward with this. And look, this might just be a big runaround, right? If Germany says yes, then France might say no. If France says yes, Britain might say no, right? We don't know. We don't know what's going on behind closed doors. But the truth is, if we want the statement by the Biden administration that they're going to fight for this waiver to be meaningful, to actually be operative, to be worth all the fight that we put in, then we have to continue to push this administration to use whatever abilities it has to get other countries to come on board. Now, oftentimes in the WTO, lots of nations just do what the United States does, because we continue to act in this very kind of neo-colonial way as the global hegemon who, pulls some strings to get things the way that other countries want them, and pissing off the US has typically been an issue for other countries. So at the World Trade Organization, government by consensus often means government by the US, which obviously that's not really how this should work, but I don't have a good thought for how we kind of dismantle this global hegemony of the United States. I don't really know what the best way to approach that would be. But the truth is what I was saying before, which is, if we want this victory, as it were, to actually be meaningful and not just be a token victory that Biden can just claim that he got the win for and do a media tour and say, oh, I'm such a good guy, I said I'm going to do the thing. In order for this victory to mean anything at all for us as the American people, but also for the world, remember, this is a world effort. We are trying to vaccinate the world to end a deadly pandemic, right? This isn't just about politicking. This isn't about petty points. This is about people's lives, life and death. So in order for this victory to be really meaningful, or to even be a victory at all, we have to keep up the pressure on the Biden administration to convince Germany and whatever other country might cross us in this effort to waive these patent rights. And look, this is going to be an incredibly tough fight, and it may only provide a temporary reprieve, but hopefully it will be enough to end this pandemic. Because if not, we know what the consequences are, and they're not pretty. So the last of my kind of COVID-related stories that I want to touch on this week is, you may have heard a little bit about the concept of vaccine passports. So internally in the United States, there's been some talk of a vaccine passport, but there's been fierce opposition from the right wing in this country for vaccine passports, partially because they house a very large and unfortunately growing vaccine skeptic anti-vax or anti-mask movement. So there's definitely some politicking that's going on here about how vaccine passports might be used and things like that, and claims of revocation of freedoms and yada, 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 usual right-wing bullshit talking points. But what's interesting is that other countries, like the United States exists in an international system, and there is some conversation going on in other countries, including our neighbor to the north, Canada, that will require vaccines, vaccine cards to be present, or vaccine passports to be present in order to travel. So, for example, the European Union is in the middle of creating a digital vaccine passport. I think it'd be like a little chip, or like a card with a chip in it that you can get if you can prove you've gotten a vaccine, and then you can travel. And this will be just kind of like a digital ID card. You'll scan it, be like, okay, like you can go through, you're fine, type of thing. And obviously there are privacy implications there, because a vaccine is health data. And that type of health data is typically protected, especially protected in Europe. So of course, this is back and forth, but there is increasing pressure on countries to implement some form of vaccine passports. So this presents an interesting dilemma for the Biden administration, for the United States as a whole, which is there is a ton of political opposition in the US to vaccine passports, but what happens if there is no way for Americans to travel without a vaccine passport, right? So you get to this weird place where in order to interact with the remainder of the world, there may have to be an implementation of a vaccine passport for people to travel inside the US, because there may be, it may be forced on us from the outside, right? So anywhere that Americans might try and travel may ask for a vaccine passport. So if we don't have a vaccine passport to give them, effectively we're going to be shut out at the door, right? And my guess is, and I don't know how this is going to work specifically, but my best guess is that these vaccine passport checks will be done domestically by foreign officials who are in our airports and things like that, or by the airlines themselves, right? Who will be required by the destination airports to provide vaccine passports for everyone coming in. So imagine you're trying to cross the Atlantic, right? You're going to Spain for a summer holiday or whatever, and you go to get on your plane, and they ask you for the usual stuff: passport, boarding pass, but then they ask you for something else. They ask you for a vaccine passport. Well, if you don't have one because you're an American citizen and there's been no vaccine passport, or you haven't been told to apply for one, or there hasn't been an implementation of one, they're just going to turn you away. And if you're lucky, they'll refund your plane ticket and your hotel and your rental car and everything that you probably prepared trying to go for this trip. So the point I'm trying to make here by this example is that you essentially are at the whim of other countries for any travel at all, or else Americans are just going to be stuck having, not being able to travel anywhere else. There's also an interesting legal angle to this, especially when traveling within the United States is concerned. So in the Constitution, I'm forgetting what clause it is or what article, but there's a provision essentially that says that you as an American have right to free transportation between all the states. So, and I talked about this earlier on the show, earlier in the pandemic, about issues I believe I did, about issues concerning, whether certain states would try and keep people out unless they had a vaccine. This is a vaccine passport. The legal implementation of a vaccine passport between states may actually not stand up to constitutional muster. So it would be very interesting to see whether this is allowed to be done at the state level, because as you can probably guess, if you're familiar with US politics, is that all the states that are controlled by Democrats will likely put in place these vaccine passport requirements for interstate travel, and all the states that are controlled by Republicans won't, because their base are partially anti-vaxxers, right? And that's not, it's just a fact. It is what it is. So, and of course, anytime that anything like this happens, of course, it goes to the Supreme Court and there's a whole big fuss over it. So it hasn't happened yet, right? Because these interstate vaccine passports haven't been implemented, but it'll be very interesting to see what happens if this is the route people go, because the truth is people want to be able to travel again, and they definitely want to travel internationally. They may also want to travel, between states. So in order to do this, we're going to have to find some system by which we can trust that people coming in to the country or into a different state are vaccinated, because people are going to want to try and get their lives back to normal. So my guess is there's going to have to be some sort of federal law about this, based on the Commerce Clause, about vaccine passports domestically, and obviously the federal government will be responsible for any law having to do with vaccine passports internationally. But to close this story out, because I've been rambling for a while now, essentially it does look like there's a possibility that by the end of the summer, vaccine passports may be a real thing in the United States, not because American politicians are particularly thrilled about vaccine passports, or their constituencies are, but because we exist in a global forum, in a global sphere, And in order to interact with the rest of the world, we may not have a choice. We may have to implement vaccine passports for our citizens to go abroad, for our diplomats to go abroad, and for things like that. Okay, still got a good amount of time left. So I want to get to the tax portion of this, and it's going to be pretty heavy. So I'm going to try and knock this out kind of little bit by little bit. I'm going to give a lot of context here. I'm going to try and give a lot of context here so that we can really understand the terms that we're playing with and be in a place where we're talking the same language and I'm not talking over everyone's head, right? The whole point of this show is to be accessible, whether it's teaching how to make bread or talking about worker-centric politics and things like that. So I'm going to try and give as much context here as possible. As usual, if I say something that is wrong or that you misunderstand or there's some other issue with what I was saying, please leave a comment in this video or on the clips. I read all comments that come in, and I will either make a correction or respond to your comment, and we'll have a dialogue, because again, the whole purpose of this show is to do it together, whether that happens during the live streams each week or whether it happens over comments later on. So the first bit of tax stuff that I want to talk about is, what is the difference between labor-based income tax, so income tax, and capital gains tax? So you probably have a decent idea, if you're a working person, you probably have a decent idea of what labor tax is, right? So you work for a company, you get your paycheck, there's a whole set of line items where you get your Social Security tax taken out, your Medicare tax taken out, your state tax taken out, your municipality tax taken out, right? Those are your typical labor taxes. That's income taxes. That tax is based on the amount of income you make, and there are marginal rates. What's a marginal rate? A marginal rate is the amount of tax you pay on a certain grouping of money. So for an illustrative example, say you make $40,000 a year, and I'm not using the actual tax numbers, I'm just making these numbers up. So if you do want to see what the actual tax code is, it's available online at irs.gov. But let's take an example, right? So say you make $40,000 in a year. So let's say the federal government says that up to $12,000, you pay 0% tax on that. Okay, fair. So that makes sense. So you get to keep the first $12,000 that you make. So then it says on any amount of money you make over $12,000 and under $30,000, you pay 10% of tax on that. Okay, so we've now covered the first $30,000 a year that you've made, and the $18,000 in this middle portion here will be taxed at 10%. So 10% of 18,000 is $1,800. Okay, so that's $1,800 worth of tax you're going to pay. Now let's say that on any amount of money you make over 30,000 and above, they're going to take 15%. Okay, so now you've only made, because you're making $40,000 a year, you've only made $10,000 more than the rate you would have paid up to $30,000. So what happens is that $10,000 is then taxed at that 15% rate. 15% of $10,000 is $1,500. So you add that marginal tax to the marginal tax you paid on your middle 18,000, which was 1,800. So you add 1,800 plus 1,500, and you get $3,300, which will be your total taxes for that amount of money. So that's what marginal tax rate means. It just means the amount of money that you make is divided into sections, and those sections are taxed at different rates. So there's just a general idea of how labor taxes typically work. But anyway, so labor tax is assessed based on the amount of money that you get for working, for going to job, working a job, 8 hours a day, however, whatever your working situation is, the money that you get from there is taxed. Now that's just if you're an employee, okay? So many people now are no longer working standard employee jobs. They're working gigs or in the gig economy as independent contractors. So independent contractors are assessed a slightly higher rate for their work. And that's taxed differently. So maybe instead of between the 12,000 and 30,000, instead of getting charged 10% in tax, maybe it's 12%. I don't know the numbers. You should look online to find these numbers, but I'm just giving you examples so that you can see pretty much how this works. So this is kind of your regular labor income tax that most workers, regardless of they're working a gig job or a regular employment job, this is something you'll be familiar with because this is the type of work tax relationship that you're used to. Okay, so that's the first type of taxes. And this is by far the most common type of tax collected. Then there is capital gains tax, which is a different type of tax. And this tax works a little bit differently. So instead of being on the amount of money you're paid for selling your labor to an employer, this capital gains is a tax that is levied on the benefit that you make from investments. So this can come in a variety of different ways, and the way that this benefit is assessed changes depending on how you do. So say you buy a house, okay? And again, there are lots of different rules about this. If you want more information, go to irs.gov. But say you buy a house, and when you buy the house, it's a $100,000 house. Okay. So say you live in this house for 20 years, and you do repairs on it, you make it nicer, whatever. So at the end of 20 years, you want to sell the house. And now it's worth $200,000. So you sell the house for $200,000. So in the time that you've owned this house, which by the way is considered an asset, the house has appreciated in value $100,000. So it's considered that you have made $100,000 by this sale. Now there are other things considered like the time value of money, but we're just going with easy examples here. So on this $100,000 that you have made from the selling of your house and its appreciation value, the government wants a tax on that. So there might be, there'll be some percent tax that you pay on that amount of money, and that is the capital gains. So let's say it's 5%, right? So you pay $5,000 on that, and that's your capital gains tax for the appreciation of your house. Okay, so that's for an appreciating asset for a large appreciating asset like a house. Now people do this not just with houses, they do this with hotels, other buildings. Buildings can be bought, sold, and traded. Much like any other asset, and they appreciate and depreciate in value, and the tax is taken appropriately and accordingly, in theory. But oftentimes, before I get to that, another asset that is frequently taxed with capital gains are your investment rates. And these, like on the house model, don't come into effect until you actually make money from them, right? So if you have a dividend, that dividend can be taxed. It will also be taxed at capital gains rates, but this is passive income, right? So if you have a stock portfolio, many of us do for our 401ks if we have them, because the pension system is essentially dead unless you work for the federal government or a state government. But so your 401k, it pays dividends, right? The company thanks you, in theory, for sticking with them with your stock. They pay you a dividend. You probably put that dividend right back in your account. But whatever, if it's large enough, the federal government wants their cut. So they take some percentage of all that dividend money that's coming to you. Additionally, the federal government takes a cut again when you go to sell the stock. So if you live up your 401k, you don't touch it up until you want to retire, you then decide to take all that money out of the system. That money has appreciated now a significant amount, plus you've added money to it. The government wants a cut of the amount of money that has appreciated from that account. and they take some percentage of it. They take some percentage of it once you sell it. So, if you sell it for $400,000 or whatever, that they want some cut of that. So that's how capital gains works. So the reason I'm telling you about capital gains tax versus labor income tax and independent contractor or IC tax work is because there is an interesting phenomenon that occurs in the United States tax code where labor income is taxed at a higher rate than what's called passive income or capital gains rates. And there's a bunch of different ways that capital gains rates are taxed, but for now, it just makes more sense to talk about them as labor versus capital gains. So the value of your labor is essentially assessed as more tax-worthy than the value of passive income. Now, this system obviously benefits the rich, who are able to spend more of their money on investments and are able to collect more passive income than an employee or a worker who has to sell their labor in order to make money, and then that money can be taxed, right? And oftentimes, by the way, the money coming out of that employee-employer relationship or client-contractor relationship is much, much lower than the amount of money coming out of passive income. So the system obviously benefits the rich. And the rich in the United States are almost entirely the capitalist class. Very few people in the middle class ever get rich. And if they do, the amount of rich that they get is so minuscule compared to that of the capitalist class that they're effectively with the rest of us as labor workers. So this is obviously unfair to the workers, and it presents an opportunity where we can change the tax code and collect a lot more money from those people who are not working for a living. Now look, if they're working for a living, then that income will be assessed at labor rates, and their passive income will be assessed at capital gains rates, and that's fine, whatever. But in order to, and I talked last week about funding the IRS is class war. This is another method at which where the workers can fight back against the capitalist class and bring real democratization to the economy, which is to tax passive income rates much higher than they are now, and at least as high and preferably higher than labor income tax rates. Because we should be encouraging people to work instead of invest, and not because there's anything particularly great about work, but if people are going to sell their labor, they're going to sell their time. We should honor that sacrifice by taking less of that money than for people who are not doing anything and just enjoying the high life and just allowing their investments to pay them and for them to continue to stay rich that way. So in order to continue in order to reverse the class war that's been perpetuated on the working class of this country, as well as funding the IRS, like I talked about last week, one of the ways that we can fundamentally change the tax burdens in this country and thus create real redistribution is by taxing the rich and passive income much more than we tax labor income, which will allow for more money to come from the rich and less money to come from the poor. And thus, by using that to bolster social programs or just to diminish the amount of inequality in the country, we bring back, we make our system, our economic system, and our political system by proxy more democratic in general, which is an inherently good thing for socialists, but also for the working class and the working people as a whole. Okay, so the next portion of this kind of tax kick that I'm on today, I want to talk about how to tax the rich. So this conversation is a little tricky because the rich have lots of ways to diversify the way that they handle their money, and they spend lots of time and energy hiding that money from people who could take it from them. So if we think we should, so first, it's helpful to understand how it is the rich store their money and how they protect it from tax. So the first and most obvious way is just to ship it to an offshore bank account, right? To have a bank account in the Cayman Islands or in Panama or some other country that doesn't charge taxes the way that we do in the US, and just send their money there, right? The second way that individuals who are incredibly wealthy hide their money is they do it in assets. So they buy houses, they buy buildings, they buy hotels, they buy boats, they buy cars, right? These are all methods for the wealthy to hide their income and to hide their money. One of the ways that the rich are very good at hiding their income is that they incorporate themselves. It's not them getting paid, it's their company getting paid, and they just, they have business expenses or what have you. They use these shell companies to play games, essentially, where they can move the money around and then it gets lost. And it becomes almost impossible for the IRS to track. By the way, this is one of the reasons that the IRS very rarely audits rich people, because it's very difficult for them to track down where all this money is, because it's either constantly moving or it's moving out of the country and things like that, right? There's a whole mess of ways that the rich hide their money. So how do we counter that? How do we tax the rich? So definitely one of the ways that we tax the rich is to increase the amount of money that we collect from all capital gains that are made, like I talked about in the last segment. But there are some other ways too. So one would be a lever's tax. So a lever's tax essentially says anytime that you move your money offshore by some mechanism or another, that money is taxed at a certain percentage. And you would want that percentage to be fairly high, almost high enough to be punitive. And the reason you do this is to encourage that money to stay domestically. It's important for that money to stay within the country, because then it can benefit the economy in that country as opposed to being held somewhere else or benefiting the economy of another country, right? So there's actually a national interest in having a lever's tax that's very high. We're also going to talk about a lever's tax when we talk about corporations, but the context is a little different. So so that would mean that any time that money is being transferred digitally, and remember that most money is digital nowadays. Your bank account may have some number of dollars in it, but you're almost never going to have that amount of dollars on your person. And given the time value of money and how most banks will give you some level of interest for your money, it is almost guaranteed that putting your money in a financial institution that is interest bearing, even if nominally so, is always going to be a better investment for you. But that aside, so anytime that this money transfers digitally to another location, the bank is forced to withhold some of that money for tax purposes. And again, you want that number to be very, very high. And you can use marginal tax rates for that too, right? You can say up to a certain amount of money, transferring it offshore is very cheap, but anything more than that will be more expensive, and you can create iterations and yada, yada, right? There's a whole mess of ways you can do that. But so the first way to do that is a lever's tax. The second way to do this is a luxury goods tax. Now, if you think about luxury goods, we may be talking, luxury goods are not always the same to everybody. So when I'm talking about luxury goods, I'm talking about incredibly expensive things like cars, boats, luxury RVs, things like that. Now, this may include things like $5,000 handbags or whatever, or very expensive fur coats, right? It will be up to a regulator to determine what types of items classify as luxury items. But generally, we have a sense of what a luxury item is, right? It's an item that's very expensive for its class of products. Maybe there's some Maybe there's some statistical way to tell if something's a luxury item versus a non-luxury item, right? Like a $3,000 bed versus a $500 bed or something like that. The point is, this would all have to be done. There's some level of interpretation to be done there. But so if you implement a luxury goods tax, and again, make it fairly high, you reduce the amount of luxury goods being purchased. And although the argument may be that, oh, well, if the rich are purchasing luxury goods, then that money is going into the economy and it's benefiting the workers who make the thing. And I hear you. But if you balance it correctly, you can reduce the number of luxury goods being purchased just enough so you're not stopping them from buying luxury goods, right? There's a good chance that no matter what the tax on a luxury good is, the rich will still buy it, because oftentimes these things are status symbols and they're more about our psychology than they are about our wallets. But there's a way to meddle with the numbers so that you can essentially figure out how much the rich would be willing to pay extra for the luxury good. You put a tax on top of that. Think of it like a sales tax, but instead of impacting the poor, like most sales taxes do, this would be a sales tax for the rich. This can also apply for things like assets. Now, the tax wouldn't be like a luxury good tax, but it would be, you could have, for example, like a second home tax, or a tax that is specific to buying assets, right? So if someone is making their money and they decide they're going to invest in a business, they're going to buy a business, right? Maybe we allow for the first individual to, the first business they buy to be tax-free or tax low, right? But after that, you can make the tax increasingly high up until the punitive amounts, so that there is less monopoly and oligopoly control of these businesses and these assets and things. This is especially true with housing, where the rich and development companies are using their vast sums of assets to buy lots of developments and to rent them, as opposed to allowing regular people to buy homes. I talked about this an episode or two ago about the international housing crisis. So this is another way we can tax the rich, right? Create an asset tax. Again, this will have to be on regulators to figure out how much this money should be. But essentially, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to take the standard money-hiding behaviors of the rich and tax them, and sometimes punitively, because the truth is, it's oftentimes the case that we do not want these behaviors to persist, right? We don't want rich people buying homes that they're never going to live in and taking them off the market and causing the housing prices to rise for regular people, right? We want to stop that behavior. We want to stop the rich from sending their money offshore, from incorporating themselves and essentially playing a shell game with small corporations so the money can never be traced, right? There are behaviors that we want to limit, and we can do that through taxing. And when we do that, we begin to collect a lot more money from the rich. And once we do that, what happens is the tax burden shifts, because you no longer need to collect as much money from the poor and the middle class in this country and in all countries once you're collecting more money for the rich. This has a number of benefits. The first and most obvious benefit is the poor pay less taxes, which is good because they don't have much money. The second benefit is the more money you take away from the rich, and because in a capitalist system, money is power, the more power you take away from the rich. And you begin to re-democratize our systems, because they can use their money to leverage political power, whether it's donations or fancy gifts or corporate lobbyists or whatever. There are ways that the rich have to influence the political systems. And it's because they have lots of extra money lying around, they don't know what to do with it. Or they do know what to do with it, and sometimes that's more dangerous than them not knowing what to do with it. But the truth is, we can create more democracy by limiting the amount of inequality we have. And the third benefit is, once there's more money coming in from the rich, less money coming in from the poor, not only do we reduce the amount of inequality, but we can also begin to justify more redistributive practices. So large-scale public safety net plans, right? Things like that, where there's no more of a worry about who we're impacting. And also, we can create more universal programs, which the rich will benefit from, but obviously not as much as the poor will. So I hope I've outlined for you, with the help of my previous segment about labor income tax and capital gains tax, how it is that we can tax the rich and what the benefits of that are for regular people generally, but also society as a whole. Okay, so I have one topic left on this tax kick, and we are quickly running out of time. So my guess is I will go a little over our hour. If I'm still talking when your bread is ready, feel free to go on without me. You know the drill. Although there is still a little surprise coming, so maybe wait a little bit. Just see how you're feeling. But if you do not want to wait for me, or you're on a time crunch and your bread is ready, obviously, go ahead, use one of our other videos to show you how to braid, or just make your bread any way you want it. But there is one last thing I want to talk about today, because we're talking about taxes, and this is how to tax corporations. So before I go on, it's really important to talk about how corporations make their money, okay? So corporations make their money in a variety of ways. The first and most obvious way is they sell a product, right? So if you think of a local company, they sell products to consumers, you pay money for those products, and then they make a profit because they pay their workers less than the benefit that the workers are giving the employer, and that's how profit is made, and that's how, right? So, okay. The second way is through investments. So companies, like regular people, can use the stock market, right? They can use their money to buy shares. Oftentimes, when a company is buying shares, they're doing it for an ownership position. They see a profitable enterprise, and they want to get in on that, so they purchase shares of it and either receive dividends or use it to do a hostile takeover. Quick aside, a hostile takeover of a company is where the ownership is forcibly replaced by its voters, but its voters have been co-opted either by a large corporation or because all the voters are now the large corporation. So that's what a hostile takeover is. It's a type of merger and it's a type of acquisition scheme that corporations use. But anyway, so the point is, corporations can also make money through investments. And another way that companies make money is by offshoring. So what offshoring is essentially the company sees that it has to expend a certain amount of money each year to do its business, whether that's creating widgets or selling services or whatever it is, and they take a look at their costs, whether their costs are labor, capital, which is workers, whether it's land capital, which is like buildings and assets, whether it's entrepreneur capital, which is like typically the C-levels or founding members. So typically they're looking at those three, and they're trying to decide whether fourth capital, money, how they can maximize that level of capital. So during the pandemic, one of the ways that we've seen that companies have done cost saving is they've closed up their offices and sent their workers home. Now, not all companies can do this, of course, especially if you're in manufacturing or you're in fast food or you're in a situation where you are unable to have your employees work from home. But in the event that they can work from home, that's a cost saving that they can have as well, right? But the other and more traditional offshoring is to say, I have a job that I pay X number of dollars in country A, and in country B, I can pay Y dollars, where Y dollars is fewer than X dollars, right? So they make a decision, which is to say they move the job from country A to country B in order to pay less money. And this is a standard cost saving money. And this is a way that companies make money as well. So that's how corporations make money. When it comes to goods and services, that is a large category, and that breaks down even further. So companies can use a couple of different methods in the sale of goods and services to make money. So one is just standard, it costs me $5 to make this item. I sell it for $7, I get $2 profit, right? There's another more complicated scheme where I have, let me just turn that off, where I have two products, product A and product B. Product A costs me $5 to make. and product B cost me $1 to make. So if you then sell both products for $5, you break even on product A because it costs you $5 to make it, and you make $4 profit on product B because product B only costs you $1 to make. So at the end of the day, where you could have said product A is $7 and product B is $3 and still made the $4 profit, you were able to keep both products the same, which of course has psychological benefits and is likely to make your customers, it depends on which one you can sell. In the restaurant industry, one of the ways that this is done is with coffee and pizza. Coffee, pizza, and other cheap goods are typically overpriced, so that items that are very expensive for the restaurant to make can be lower priced. So they either lose money on some to make high profits on others, or they break even on some to make high profits on others. But anyway, so this is a different way to do a different scheme for making money. The same thing is true with services. If one service costs a lot of money to do, but it can be bundled with a service that doesn't cost much money to do, and they can make a profit off of that, they can lose money on one service while making lots of money on another service. So you get the general idea. So in order for, and by the way, one thing you have to keep in mind whenever you tax corporations is that any time that the corporation can pass the cost of the tax onto the consumer, that's what they're going to do. Just as a matter of course, it's one of the ways that companies save money. Now, luckily, companies can typically spread out the costs of that evenly. So oftentimes consumers only notice a very marginal, a very small increase in prices. This is true about raising wages as well. So, even if someone is being paid twice as much, they raise the wage to twice as much as it might be, the cost of your food may only raise $1 or $2, or the price of your item may only raise $1 or $2 because they're spreading out that cost among multiple items being purchased. So that's how companies make money. Once companies have their money, there are lots of things that they do in order to make sure that money can't be traced and or to make sure that money can't be taxed. So one, of course, is to offshore the money. Google and Apple have their headquarters in Ireland. This is to avoid U.S. corporate taxes. Another way that companies hide their money is in charities. So you've probably noticed that every billionaire and every very rich company has a foundation of some kind that does charitable work. Well, so what happens is the corporation gives lots of money to the charity, and the charity probably is doing charitable work. So I don't want to discount that, but I've talked enough about how charity is not sustainable today that hopefully I don't have to redress it. But if you are interested in that, go to my video on COVAX, vaccines. COVAX and vaccines, change, not charity, and I'll talk a little bit why charity is really not sustainable. But anyway, so they have these charities, and what ends up happening is, like any individual, a corporation can write off their charitable contributions as tax deductible, right? And of course, if you give enough money to these charities, your taxes are so low that sometimes the government pays you, right? So this is another way that corporations keep their money, or at least avoid taxes. Yeah, so those are the two major ways. There are some other ways that companies hide their money, like having lots of little shell corporations where money flows through little bits at a time, small enough to only pay little bits of tax on them. And there's lots of complex schemes there, but we really don't have enough time to talk about them today. Maybe I'll pick up on it on another day. But for now, so how do we tax corporations? How do we get over these hurdles that corporations are putting in front of government in order to stop them from collecting taxes? So like my comment with taxing the rich, you can implement a leavers tax. Anytime corporate money or a corporate job leaves a country, there can be a tax on that. If one way to do this is a tariff, which is to say that you make it unsustainable for a product you made overseas. So essentially what happens is if a product used to be made in country A and then is shipped to country B to be made there and then shipped back to country A can pass a law saying that any good coming from country B is going to be taxed at such a high rate that essentially the price of it to consumers in country A becomes prohibitive. So they buy some other product that is made in country A. And then, of course, the hope is that the company will bring the manufacturing back to country A to avoid the tax, right? So this is a lever's tax or a tariff. And they work in slightly different ways, but it's more or less the same idea. You're punishing money for leaving the country. Another way you can do this is you can implement higher taxes on companies that are not based in your country. This would be like a headquarters tax deduction or something like that. You could make the corporate taxes much higher and then say, hey, if you incorporate in our country, or if you have a principal place of business in our country and you're making goods here, we'll waive a tax or we'll reduce the tax for you as well. Another thing, of course, is to tax a company based on how many shell companies they have. Now, this is going to be difficult to do, partially because lots of these shell companies are opaque, but there are often reporting requirements for companies, so you actually do get to see how complex these corporate structures are, and you can count the amount of shell companies they have and holding companies and what have you, and you can tax those as is. Again, this is a role for bureaucrats who are able to look at the numbers and decide what will be cost prohibitive for these corporations and whatnot. But essentially, at the end of the day, these are some ways that we can use as workers in our advocacy for more worker power and more economic democracy, and in taxing the rich, in taxing corporations, to make sure that we are making sure that they pay their fair share, and so that the tax burden on us, on regular people, is reduced as well. Okay, so that is it for our politics. Our bread has risen. It's definitely doubled in size. If this isn't big enough for you, if you don't, for some reason, you don't like the size of this, feel free to let it rise a little bit more. But for now, I'm going to wash my hands, and then we are going to take this bread out, and we're going to do our twist. So I'll be right back. Okay, so as promised, we are making our challah with a twist this week, which is to say we are actually making a twist. So we're going to take our challah out here, and instead of doing the normal division, I'm just going to take, now I'm trying not to get a ton of the oil out because I'm not going to do a ton of kneading. It's all right. Put this here. Okay. And so what we're going to do this week with our challah is, instead of cutting it into braids, we're just going to knead it real quick until it's a solid mass. And you may need flour to do this, that's okay. And by the way, in this kneading process, we are trying to get out all the air bubbles. So keep kneading it till you hear the air bubbles come out. Also, you want to get back some of that shapeliness to it. You want it to be one mass. So give it a knead for a minute or two, making sure to get out those air bubbles, incorporating the oil into it. You don't really need to add flour for this process because it's really not going to be that much of an issue. But you just want to get it into a ball again, kneading for a minute or so until it's back nice and doughy and not so much like a oily mass. So the dough should be fairly easy to work with at this point. It shouldn't give you too much trouble. It'll be a little firmer as you kind of push out the air, but that's all right. And as you can see, my ball of dough is kind of coming back together into a ball. So what we're going to do is we're going to roll it back into a ball here, just using the regular cupping motion we've used in the past. And now we're going to do something really fun. All right, so we're going to take our big ball of dough and we're going to roll it out into one long log. Now we want our log to be about 2 inches wide, so 1.5 inches to 2 inches wide, and we want it to be pretty long. So because we're going to make a big old twist with this, and I'm keeping my little thing of flour right there just in case, but probably we won't need it. But just keep rolling. So I'm putting my hands on just flat. I'm starting from the middle and I'm pushing out little by little. We don't want to tear the dough at this point, because if we do, it's not really going to want to stick back together. So we're just slowly and steadily. And by the way, you don't need to taper the ends as well. So your ends can be flat for this. It's fine. And we're just going to slowly and carefully ease this into a nice long shape. And so spoilers, I have never done this before. I've never made a twist, but I thought, you know, it might be fun for Mother's Day to make something different. Mother's Day weekend to make something different. And so that's what we're doing. We are doing something that we don't normally do, which is to make a twist with our challah. And actually, you should try this. You don't have to just do it with challah. You can do it with other breads too. I would love to hear what recipes you guys are using for your breads. I know not everyone is making the same recipe that I make every week, which is just fine. If you have a recipe that you like making, you can still make it with me or send it in. I would love to make your bread recipe. That'd be so much fun. I love trying new bread recipes. So if you have a recipe that you like, that you make, or a family recipe, or just a recipe that like you're not comfortable making, send it in. I'll make it on the show. I'll tell you how to do it. We'll do it together if you want. We all good. All right, so this is about 2 inches long. Sorry, 2 inches long. Okay. This is about 2 inches wide. I'm going to keep working this. I think I'm going to do about an 1.5 inches wide. See if I can't get this to. So I'm going to roll out. So I'm running out of room on my board here, you can see. So I'm going to try and roll this out closer to like 1.5 inches, because I'm going to need some room to twist this when the time is right. Okay. All right. So that looks pretty thin. So let's get this going down here. All right, we are getting very long at this point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start angling this so that we can get a nice long dough here, a nice long dough here for our twist. You can kind of see what I'm going to do, which is create a large twist from this. So, all right, so we've got our twist about this long. All right, so that didn't work. So let's just roll this out again, make sure we got the right length. So we're just gonna twist. 1, 2, 3, 4. And we're gonna take our ends and tuck under here. Make sure this is nice and flat. You can even emphasize the round part on this end if we want. So you can see it's going to want to twist itself over. So just give it a quick 1, 2, moving it in opposite directions for our twist. And voila, there is our twist. Let me put it on a tray. And then you can see for yourself this gorgeous twist we've made here. All right. So take a look at our twist. So we're going to let this sit now. I want to put it on the diagonal. We're going to let this sit now for another hour. This is going to double in size, hopefully. Actually, I'm going to transfer this to a larger tray, but I'm going to do it off camera. But so what's going to happen now is our twist is going to rise here for 1 hour. I'm going to bid you farewell. And once you are ready, you are going to set your oven to 350 degrees. While it is heating up, you are going to paint your challah twist with beaten egg, with a paintbrush or a spoon or however you want to do it. And once you do that, it'll be ready to go into your oven. If you are applying sesame seeds to yours, I'm not going to, but if you want to, you just sprinkle some sesame seeds on once you have put your egg mixture on it. And you're going to let it sit in the 350 degree oven for 35 minutes, rotating at 17 minutes. When it's done, you will know it's done because it'll have a nice, beautiful brown color on it. And if you knock on it with your knuckles, it will sound hollow. Or if you have a thermometer, you want it to be between 200 and 210 degrees, preferably above 205. All right? All right, guys, that is it for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you have a great loaf. I'd love to see the pictures of the bread you're making. Please send them in to us on Facebook and on YouTube, if that's possible for you to do. And we will see you next week for another episode of Let Them Eat Bread. Take care, everyone.